Hello and welcome to the webinar on cabbage worm management on long-term organic farms by Jake Asplund and Doug O'Brien. My name is Alice Formiga and I'm the webinar coordinator for eOrganic. eOrganic is the organic agriculture community of practice with e-extension. You can find all of our published articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at extension.org/organic_production. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a very quick rundown on how today's webinar will work. The presentation will last about 45 minutes, and after that, we'll have an additional 30 minutes for your questions. We'll be reading the questions out loud after the presentation is over, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. So today, we're very glad to be welcoming back Doug O'Brien and hosting Jake Asplund for the first time. Jake is a PhD student in entomology at Washington State University, and his work focuses on examining arthropod community interactions in agriculture. Doug O'Brien owns and operates Doug O'Brien Agricultural Consulting, providing on-site technical advice, field monitoring, and research for clients involved in fresh produce growing, harvesting, cooling, and marketing. He's also an adjunct professor at Cabrillo College in Santa Cruz, California, where he teaches classes in organic farming. Previously, Doug was a co-owner of an organic produce brokerage company, a crop production manager, and an assistant farm advisor. So with that, I would like to hand this over to our first presenter, Jake Asplund. So Jake, if you could unmute, and I just gave you control of the screen.
All right. Thank you, Alice. Like she said, my name is Jake Asplund, and my background is primarily in insect ecology and habitat restoration, which is why I am really glad to be presenting with someone as knowledgeable about farming as Doug is. Direct your farming questions to him. And today we are going to be talking about three pests, cabbage worm, diamondback moth, and cabbage looper. All right, like I said, I want to say thanks to the project farmers and other researchers who have been involved. So digging in, first thing I want to talk about, the first pest that I would like to talk about is Pieris rapi, also known as cabbage worm, imported cabbage worm, ICW, or often just the worm, and is most likely the most visible and well-known butterfly in the production of brassicas, as they are quite large and tend to flitter about a few feet above the plants. These butterflies are specialist herbivores, and while in the lab they've been shown to be able to survive on non-brassica plants, in the wild it's quite rare. They overwinter as pupae and emerge in the spring to look for mates and new hosts. And once they find their hosts, which can include the crops, they'll have multiple generations throughout the growing season. And this makes them an especially problematic pest. The larvae of these butterflies tends to be found resting along the veins of the plants during the day, and while they're feeding, which is most often at the edge of the leaves, they can cut very large and non-symmetrical holes in these leaves. I thought it was worth noting that these cabbage worms express a behavior in which they rarely feed on a single leaf for a long time and tend to wander about the plant, which is especially damaging for crops like cabbage or kale, where the look of the leaves can be very important. And on the slide, as you guys can see, I've put some of the incubation times for each of the life stages. This is temperature dependent, but gives you an idea how quickly they can go from egg to full butterfly. The second one that we're going to deal with is the diamondback moth, Plutella xylostella, which is also a common member of the mixed vegetable community, though not seen quite as much because they are much smaller and tend to stick to flying within and amongst the leaves of the plants rather than flying above them like the cabbage worm. The larvae of these moths are quite small and are almost exclusively found on the other sides of leaves, where they can be quite common. And one of the things that can help diagnose whether or not you have these particular moths is that their feeding pattern tends to cause what's called window painting, where they don't eat their entire way through the leaf, but instead leave the upper epidermis of the leaf intact, which can leave the whole covered over and looks kind of see-through like a window. This portion of the leaf will eventually drop out as it dies. However, for a little bit of time, you can definitely see that. Finally, we're going to deal with the cabbage looper, Trichoplutia knee, which is the third pest. Unlike the previous two, which are specialists and deal almost exclusively on brassicas and wild mustards, these are generalists and can be found on a wide variety, including melons and tomatoes. Fortunately, I guess fortunately for the farmers, there is currently a virus that attacks these butterflies, or sorry, these moths, which can have a dramatic effect on the population and leads to wide swings in abundance. You'll have a lot of them one year, and the next year they'll be completely missing. But unfortunately, they are also very strong flyers with a very high dispersal capability. So just because they're absent for one year does not mean they couldn't be a large problem the next. Control, there's a couple traditional methods for control for Lepidopteran pests, primarily chemical control or row covers. With chemical control, the most common one now is BT. And I wanted to put this up here so that you can kind of see this is at the UC Davis. This is a table UC Davis has put out to show some of the effects of these controls and whether they affect just the Lepidopteran pests or a wide variety. You can see that you have the common name in the first column, mode of action in the second one, and as you can see on the right side and with some of the text that corresponds to the table, one of the big things to note is that the mode of action should never be overlapping with one or from one chemical to the other. Because that can lead to an increase in resistance being acquired within the population. And also, this table is actually only a small portion of the full table that UC Davis has put out. It was too large to fit on the screen, so I shrunk it down quite a bit. But you can, the other columns relate to different pests as well as natural enemies which can be affected by these pesticides, and making sure that you don't spray at a time when it might be affecting things like your predators or your parasitoids or even honeybees is important to maintain the health of the crop as a whole. So getting into some of those natural enemies that help out when it comes to dealing with the pests on your crop. These are some of the generalist predators which can feed both on the foliage as well as on the ground. Though some of them are more active than others, like the nabbed predators on the left have a tendency to be able to climb up into the foliage and actively hunt for the for the pests, like some of the spiders, whereas the carabid beetles and some of the other ground predators can only interact with the pests when they happen to fall off the leaf or they're traveling from plant to plant. One of the other things I wanted to make sure to note was that there are some predators like the coccinellids, the lady beetles, that are very size dependent and can only interact and only prey upon these butterflies when the caterpillars are either in the first or one or two instars or in the egg stage. When they get larger, they actually become too large to deal with, and the effectiveness of those natural enemies decrease significantly. And then along with the generalist predators, there are also very specialized predators as well as these parasitoids, which deal with only one or couple of the pest species. The ones that I have provided here could show one parasitoids, which each deal with one of the pests specifically. One of the things, like the other predators that I wanted to make sure to mention, was that these can only interact with the larvae at very small life stages. Some of them are strictly egg predators, and while some of them can attack various life stages from small or some of the smaller larvae, and there are some parasitoids that attack pupae, they are very specialized and can provide a measure of control, but that specialization can also be a drawback. Let's see here. And with that, I would like to pass over to Doug, who's going to talk about the farming systems.
All right, thanks, Jake. I'm just going to back up for a second because we did miss the outline slide. So what we should have introduced the topic with is systems organic management suppresses cabbage worm outbreaks and the evidence from 4 long-term organic farms. So the idea here was that we'd first talk about the biology and management of the three
Muted.
because this is kind of our test study, our test case here. And Jake's done that quite ably. So these are the pests that we're going to be talking about today. But then we want to discuss how to manage them by looking into long-term organic farm systems and analysis. And this is kind of a test case for that. So we've already had the biology and management. Then I'll introduce these long-term organic farm systems and how we analyze them. Then we'll present the evidence from the 4 farms in the study that shows that we have got cabbage worm control. Then we'll discuss the 4 systems more in detail, where we'll look at the actual tools and strategies that the farms are using for cabbage worm control. And then finally, we'll look at the different tools and strategies that all the farms are using, and we'll look at it across all 4 farms to see if we can maybe tease out some of the important system components. All right, so bear with me while I go past Jake's slides into the first one about systems. All right, here we are. So as I mentioned, this presentation on cabbage worms is really part of a larger project. And modern organic farming is at an exciting and unique point in time, really. There are finally enough long-term successful organic vegetable farms for a credible, wide-ranging study of whole farm systems. And our goal is to use these farm systems to identify both problems that have been solved and problems that have not been solved. Now, cabbage worms are a problem that has been solved, as you will see. But we do have several, and we have several problems similar to cabbage worm. But we're also identifying problems that are really so serious that the risk is unacceptable to conventional farmers who might be considering converting to organic. So we hope to provide direction to researchers that, these X problems are solved, so prioritize these X ones that are not. Okay, so what does a farm need to be part of the study? And here we have a picture of Phil Foster Ranches. This is his San Juan Bautista farm. And the first thing we're looking for is whole farm tools and strategies. A couple of examples here. You can see that pile of on-farm made compost. Long-term farms putting in a compost yard, they wouldn't do that if they weren't going to be there a long time. You can see solar panels on his coolers. You don't build coolers if you're not going to be farming for a long time. And then you can see a mature hedgerow on the right, these tall perennial plants that have been there for probably 10 or 15 years. And also in the background, you can see his house. And you don't really build your house on the farm if you're not going to be farming there a long time. So clearly, it's been here a long time, lots of whole farm tools and strategies. And then things get kind of unique, wherein a farm in our study will start to integrate their pest and soil management with the climate, the location, the marketing, and the philosophical uniqueness. So the 4 farms that we've chosen for this particular study all have these things in common. Lots of tools and strategies that affect the whole farm. They've been in business for many, many years. And while they have lots of differences with regard to climate, location, marketing, and their philosophical uniqueness, everything's all integrated together. Now, oops. Let's see if I can go back. There's a lot of lag here. Sorry, everybody. On to the analysis. Now, it's really important that we accept the main assumption of our project. And that main assumption is that we can get meaningful information by complementing the standard reductionist scientist with descriptions of working systems. And so to accept this assumption, we need very high standards for our systems, hence the long-term and successful parts of the farms, and then backed up with yield and spray records. So our goal is to identify system strategies and tools that work and don't work. So this is our process. First of all, we develop a farm system description. So this is really looking at the farm in detail and everything that is being done on the farm, and then the farmer's perceptions about the trends with the available data from farm records and on-farm data sets. And these farm system descriptions can be found on eOrganic for at least some of these farms, and if they're not, in the near future, they'll all be up. so you can really see what it is that makes the farm tick. Secondly, we develop a farm system analysis. So we have this farm system description, and then we delve into that to identify whole farm system management strategies and tools that are working and not working on the individual farms. And then we look at those tools and strategies across all the farms in our study. And then finally, we can summarize the innovative soil and pest management tools and strategies in a whole farm context. So we can look across all 4 farms and say, you know, what are the similar things? What are they doing that appears to be innovative and appears to be affecting the pest? And then hopefully these can be helpful to other farmers to develop their own systems. So now we're going to go into detail about, so now I'm actually going to pass this over to Jake, who will talk about the first farm in our study.
All right. So when I actually started my PhD, one of the projects that my advisor brought to me was this idea of, can we take, it was a project in partnership with Doug and with Alex Stone and with Ellen Natao down in, and it was looking at, can we take scouting notes over a long period of time and use them to try and say something about what has been going on at that farm over that time period. And so I was looking at Phil Foster ranches and taking Doug's scouting notes and converting it over to a form that could hopefully be graphed and perhaps even analyzed. And so on that ranch, that included mixed vegetables and tree fruit. That included having not just one farming system in one area, but actually 2 farming systems in 2 different areas. And then also that had seen success in control of some of these pests. You know, what could we see kind of from the historical scouting records? And in order to do that, before I say that, one of the things that I did want to note is we are seeing some success in being able to analyze that data from those scouting reports, and the graph that you can see is just looking at the averages of what we ended up having to do was a ranked measure across in order to standardize the pests across the different farms. We made a ranked measure, and you can see that there does seem to be a decrease over time from 1998 to 2012 or 2013 of the leopard option pests, specifically on broccoli. But in order to get that data, or to get those data, I had to, let me see here if I can advance this thing. There we go. I had to take the notes with Doug's scouting reports, which you can see on top, and try to convert it into some numerical form. And in order to do that, I looked for specific keywords in and amongst the notes, like light worm damage, and then take that and apply it to a certain ranked metric. In this case, light corresponds to a metric of 1, and plug that in for each day, for each crop, for each pest, which, as you might imagine, took quite a bit of time. But what's really cool about it is it takes what was done over a long period of time and puts it in a form that we can then use to try and say something about, say something numerically about what's been going on, and maybe lend some credence to what previously had been anecdotal. And with that, I think I will pass it back to Doug to talk about some of the work on the other farms.
All right, so I'm going back to the Foster Ranch because I wanted to talk about the characteristics of his particular farms. So the idea here is that we've got enough farms here that those of you who are farmers who are watching this can kind of think about your farm and how it compares to these ones. And that will help you decide whether you want to be, when you're setting up your system, whether you think the things that Phil Foster Ranches is doing are more appropriate, or whether you think some of the other farms' strategies and tools are more applicable. So anyway, Phil Foster has 2 farms, one in San Juan Bautista, one in Hollister, California. They're both somewhat close to the coast, but also somewhat inland. So they have a a kind of a moderate climate. He grows mixed vegetables and tree fruit. Some of the distinctive things about the farm are hedgerows, which are these perennial plantings that are set up so that there is always something in the hedgerow, some plant in the hedgerow that is blooming. And these blooms provide nectar and pollen to the beneficial insects that are eating the pests or laying eggs on them or doing whatever they do to them. It's also habitat for birds, and birds may also eat the pests. They sometimes also eat the crops. Phil does a lot of infield insectaries, and these are annual crops that flower, and the nectar and pollen supports the beneficial insects. He does quite rapid rotations. He has a very complicated rotation system because he grows many different kinds of vegetables, but trying to make sure that the same plant family doesn't end up on the same land very often. And so there's a lot of rotation. And then I work doing the crop scouting, and I'm out there 3 times a week and have been doing that since about, well, the 3 times a week has been since about 1998 or 97. And then before that, I was out there at least once or twice a week, starting in about 1990. So you can see just years and years and years of data, which poor Jake has had to analyze. His marketing is 1/3 wholesale and 2/3 retail. And this is somewhat important because it helps us think about the threshold levels of how many worms can be tolerated. Generally, wholesale is pretty restrictive. You can't be shipping stuff to across the country with any worms in it. So basically, threshold levels are 0 worms inside broccoli heads, can't have any. But we certainly have some very high tolerance for some worm feeding damage on outer cabbage leaves, because these aren't going to end up in the box. And very often the worms are gone by the time harvest comes around. So anyway, that's our first farm. The second one is Biodesign Farm in Stevensville, Montana. Nice picture of it you can see here, very different from Phil's circumstances. One of the most distinctive things about this farm is the living mulches between crop rows. And you can see that clover growing between the rows of broccoli. You can also see that it's surrounded by native habitat, also kind of significant. Again, you're seeing some wholesale here, and so the threshold levels, absolutely no worms inside broccoli heads, but some feeding damage. And then the graph here shows that from 1993 to 2009, early spraying of the BT, which is the Bacillus thuringiensis, the biocontrol pesticide, and then after 1999, nothing. And yields weren't affected, and so clearly cabbage worms are controlled at Biodesign Farm. Sorry about the lag. Our next farm is Persephone Farm in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, near the foothills. Some things of note about this farm are summer and winter cover crops, infield weeds, so not controlling all the weeds, native forest and riparian borders, insectary plantings, and then a variable cabbage worm threshold with 100% retail. There's a little bit of tolerance for some cabbage worm. The somewhat complicated graphs on the right here really are just showing that spraying for cabbage worm basically stopped in 1996. Flea beetle spraying has continued, and some of the materials that affect flea beetle will also perhaps control cabbage worms. But you can see that's gradually decreasing. And then there's this kind of interesting thing in from 2009 to 2014, where you can see a big drop, and that's when the planting was very close to the forest and the riparian areas. And then the second graph underneath it is just showing that yields aren't affected for broccoli, cabbage, or cauliflower. And the take-home message is no sprays for cabbage worms and crop yields unchanged. So again, some pretty good evidence that cabbage worms are being controlled on Persephone Farm. Our last farm is Wintergreen Farm in the foothills of the Coast Range in Oregon. What's noteworthy about this farm is that it's really more of a cattle operation as far as the acreage, but it does have 20 acres of mixed vegetables that are rotated with the pasture where there are cattle and the cover crops. and it's also surrounded by undisturbed native forest. The marketing is retail for the CSA, so again, a little bit of tolerance, but basically BT was sprayed regularly in the 1980s because there was a problem. From 1990 to 2013, just 2 BT sprays. So clearly not having a problem with cabbage worms on this farm either. So successful systems for cabbage worms. We're gonna delve into what it is that these farms are doing, and we have to be really careful here because this is a description of the farms. It's not a prescription, so I can't tell you if you do this, this, and this, you will control cabbage worm. This is really an entire system. I'm going to describe it. It's unique to each farm, but the use of it is that even though we maybe can't pull out individual things and say, hey, you should do this. What we can do is you can identify similarities and differences between your farm and these farms, and then you can choose tools and strategies that make sense on your farm after observing the description of these other farms. So now we're going to go into detail about each of the 4 farms. We'll start with Phil Foster Ranches. And these are the tools and strategies that make up his system. And across the top, you'll see I've listed important, less important, neutral, negative, tried, and abandoned. The column heading important really should be replaced by thought to be important because, again, we're describing this, we're not prescribing it. So I'm not saying that for sure it's important. It's just that we think it's important. We can back it up with some data. And we kind of consider things important when a farmer does it over and over, when it costs money to do it, and when it's backed up with yield and spray data. And one of the interesting things is sometimes a farmer will stop doing something and then they start it up again and keep on doing it. That's a pretty clear indication that there's a pretty strong evidence that it is important to their system. So let's jump in here. Monitoring 3 times per week. Okay, considered important, and that does cost money because I get paid for doing it, and I am out there looking for cabbage worms 3 times a week. Flexible thresholds for BT sprays. So as the years go by, I'm obviously getting better at scouting, and we're starting to see differences of how much cabbage worms we can get away with without having to spray, because the sprays cost money. We kind of have a philosophical approach of trying not to spray if we can, and so we're kind of narrowing down these thresholds, but they're quite variable. They depend on the time of year, they depend on the crop. We're much more interested in spraying imported cabbage worm when it's on broccoli, because those little worms get up inside and they're really nasty, than we are on spraying loopers, for example, on red cabbage. So we developed our own unique systems of flexible thresholds, and it's really reduced the spraying over the years. But we need that tool of BT sprays. We definitely have times of the year when we've exceeded the thresholds, and the only way we can get them down is the BT sprays. So those are the big 3 for Phil Foster Ranches. Less important, but still what we think are things that Phil's going to continue to do are the hedgerows, the infield insectaries, but you'll see there's a asterisk there, and if you go down to the bottom, you'll see infield insectaries again, and you'll see it as a negative. Now, this is a debate we're really having on the farm because we find a lot of imported cabbage worm adult moths on our infield insectaries, and it would tend to make us think that those infield insectaries are attracting those adults, they're mating, they're laying eggs, and they're part of the problem. On the other hand, of course, those infield insectaries are also attracting many beneficial insects that go after the imported cabbage worm, and we have some scientific evidence on both sides to suggest that either infield insectaries are important for control or they're possibly a negative, and maybe it changes depending on what's going on at the particular time of year and what's going on with the pest. So that's kind of one that's, at least to me at Phil Foster Ranch, is a little up in the air. Crop placement and timing. the timing is really important. June is imported cabbage worm month on broccoli, and I need to scout extremely carefully because they're very aggressive at that time of year. Late fall is another time. The rest of the year is not quite so important. So we can really vary our intensity just with the time of the year and our experience in knowing that. Cover crops, particularly the flower wing ones like vetch, stands to reason that they're nourishing the beneficial insect adults. Crop variety, you know, the cabbage worms all seem to love everything except red cabbage, and boy, they, you know, we can get away with very high thresholds on red cabbage before we see any damage. On the other hand, for broccoli, the imported cabbage worm is really bad because it's small and green and crawls inside. On cauliflower, the looper is particularly bad because it will crawl all over the head, and even one bite ruins the entire head of cauliflower. Things that are neutral is, this is something that we're doing anyway, but we don't really feel it's involved in cabbage worm control. The extensive crop rotation, reduced tillage. We don't think that that there are beetles and things in the soil that are particularly effective, and the reduced tillage is encouraging them. The non-BT pesticides we don't feel are important. Native habitat, we really don't have any very close to this farm, so we can't analyze it. I wrote down reduced tillage again, but that was an error. Beetle banks and insect habitat on the field margins. Unfortunately, a lot of the neighbors around Phil's, we just have weeds. So this is, again, not something we can really evaluate. Allowing harvested crops to flower and seed within fields is really not allowed, mostly because of cabbage aphid. We think that encourages them too much. And also with the cost of land and the climate where we are, we really want to turn those fields and get them planted to something else. We have tried releasing purchased predator insects such as lacewings. We don't do it anymore. It costs money. We didn't see any effect. And then, of course, the published thresholds for BT sprays, we've developed our own. So we've abandoned the published one. Biodesign, here's what they're up to. Monitoring, considered very important. Spring blooming weeds. Okay, when you think about it here, having those weeds that will bloom very early in the spring means we've got nectar and pollen right away for those beneficial insects. So they can go to work on the early cabbage worms. The permanent living mulch between the crop rows shelters all sorts of insects, which may be beneficial, pollen, nectar, all that kind of thing. Reduced tillage, again, going back to making sure that the soil insects aren't being destroyed by too much tillage. The native habitat, which allows refuge for those insects to come in and out of the field. And then harvested crops allowed to flower and seed within the fields. Again, the flowers and the seeds nourishing beneficial insects to attack the cabbage worms. Less important, but still part of the system and considered somewhat useful for cabbage worm control are the perennial hedgerows, crop placement and timing, the crop variety, crop rotation, the beetle banks. So these are insect habitat on the field margins, often high mode pasture that encourage beetles, infield insectaries. And then things that were tried and abandoned, the BT sprays no longer needed. Vacuuming, I shouldn't have even left this in the table because it's pretty hard to imagine how that could be important for the cabbage worms. Never tried any of the non-BT pesticides, haven't tried organic mulches, and never tried the release of purchased predator insects, and found the published thresholds for BT sprays unimportant. When we move on to Persephone, again, the spring blooming weeds, the crop placement and timing. You saw that graph of how being close to the riparian and forested areas seemed to be quite important. The 4-year pasture vegetable crop rotation, reduced tillage, native habitat, the beetle banks, and then the harvested crops allowed to flower and seed. Jury kind of out on the infield insectaries as to just how important they are, but certainly thinking they're part of the system. Organic mulches, just starting on that, so don't have enough experience yet. Monitoring hedgerows, cover crops, crop variety. Neutral on the published thresholds for the BT sprays. Tried and abandoned, basically the BT sprays no longer needed. Obviously that means that there won't be any flexible thresholds. Now the non-BT pesticide, the Pyganic, still being sprayed for flea beetle and perhaps is maybe replacing a little bit of the control that the BT would provide. On to wintergreen. Maintaining the undisturbed native plant habitat, considered very important. The beetle banks on the margins, letting the crops flower and seed. The 5 to 6 year pasture to vegetable rotation, really allowing the ground to rest and go into a completely different system when it's in pasture compared to vegetables. Reduce tillage to keep those soil insects happy. Then the winter annual weeds are tolerated as spring habitat for them. The cover crops, and especially the flowering ones, considered perhaps a little less important, but still part of the system. The BT sprays as needed. As you remember, there were a couple of sprays in the last 14 years. So the farmer's not willing to give them up as an option. And then the cilantro and other carrot family crops allowed to flower and seed to attract beneficial insects. These carrot family crops have lots of many tiny flowers, which particularly attract those little wasps, which are so helpful. Tried and abandoned hedgerows. And in a way, you wonder, why would you bother with hedgerows when, as you can see in that picture, there's plenty of taller perennial plants around the farm. And then again, tried, purchased predator insects and abandoned them. So coming to the end here, to summarize this all up, so looking across all the 4 farms and saying, okay, so what were the things that we thought to be important? So that was that first column there across all the farms. And if we start with the first one, and this actually surprises me, being a more California guy where we just don't allow the weeds to bloom at all. Excuse me. And part of this is really just due to the fact that in California, the temperature is so high that the weeds and plants are growing all year round. And if you let them bloom and they get to seed on you, you've got just a huge problem. But anyway, Persephone, Biodesign, and Wintergreen all liking to have those weeds bloom, and particularly in the spring, with an idea of pollen and nectar for those for the early cabbage worm. Reduced tillage, this idea of our soil insects like the carabid beetles are important. We're not going to rototill them to death. So reduced tillage important on all those 3 farms. Native habitat, so being surrounded by undisturbed natural areas, also very important. And I think it's important to realize that this isn't something that all farms have the luxury of. So if you don't have the luxury of native habitat, that's going to affect how you're going to view what system tools and strategies are going to be important for you. And certainly at Phil Foster Ranches, we don't have that native habitat. So that is something that we have to kind of consider our tools and strategies around that. The harvested crops allowed to flower and seed within the fields. Again, all 3 farms considering those important. The pasture vegetable crop rotation, very important on Persephone and Wintergreen, not possible really on Foster or Biodesign, so that's why it doesn't show up there. But just the fact that it's really important in the Persephone and Wintergreen would suggest that if you have a farm where you have the option of pasture to vegetables, it's probably something to really consider as part of your design. So only 2 farms showing there, but that's because the other 2 farms perhaps don't have the option. The beetle banks and insect habitat on the field margins, this may be the same thing. Those 2 farms, Persephone and Wintergreen, really have that ability to do that. and they consider it important. Phil Foster Ranches really doesn't have that possibility, and biodesign not considering it super important, but as you remember, it was in the second column as somewhat important. And finally, the last thing is the monitoring. Both biodesign and Phil Foster feeling it's very important. Part of that has got to come back to the marketing, with wholesale as part of both biodesign's and Phil Foster's marketing, monitoring to just make sure that we are not sending off any cartons that are that have any worms at all in them is really important, because one rejection can lead to a bunch more. So that's partly that. Partly, I think the monitoring on biodesign and Phil Foster relates to the personnel that's available. Helen was doing the monitoring for biodesign, very interested in watching what insects do. I'm doing the monitoring at Phil Foster, where we have many, many things to look at every week, and not just insects. We're looking at diseases, crop quality, when things are ready. So the monitoring is just an important part of the whole farm system. All right, so that's the end of my presentation, and I'll turn it back to Alice. And
unmuted.
Okay, thank you very much. We are about to go into our question and answer period. If after the webinar you have additional questions about organic farming in general, you're very welcome to use the e-extension Ask an Expert service. So I have a link to that on our screen. So we do have quite a few questions coming in. This is a question about how something was determined to be important on the different farms. Was this deemed important or not important by the farmers or by the researchers, or both?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. And yeah, it's really by both. But if, since the researchers are doing the study, they're kind of the final arbiter of this, I suppose. And again, it really comes back to, does it cost money? Are they continuing to do it over and over, despite the fact that it either costs money or time, or is, has perhaps some difficulty in making sure it happens? And is it backed up by some data? For example, on the Phil Foster ranches, Jake has 14, 15 years of pretty good data of 3 times a week of how often things are being done, and how often there are conclusions being drawn on whether or not something's important. So again, this is really uncomfortable for me as a scientist, is that I always like to hide behind my statistics and my tables to show that I have a particular probability of something being important. We really can't do this here, but we're trying to provide the information in a wider context of many, many years of experience, successful farmers who we believe wouldn't be doing things if they didn't feel they were important, and they feel they're important because they have many years of experience with them, and then some data to back up how that's being done. But this really, we do have to look at this. This isn't standard reductionist science. It's systems analysis, and it does come with some caveats that we have to be very careful of.
Okay, here's a question about this last slide. The person said, I thought that BT sprays were important on at least one of the farms. Why doesn't the last slide show it to be important?
Yeah, the reason it doesn't is because it's important on Phil Foster farms only, and it's not important to the other 3 farms. The first column of things we think are super important, it only shows up in Phil Foster and not on the other 3.
Okay.
Now this kind of comes back to, if your farm is more like Phil Foster's, BT is probably going to be important to your system. If your farm is more like Persephone, Biodesign, or Wintergreen, perhaps it's not something you're going to be doing.
Okay. Can you talk a little more about how allowing harvested crops to flower and seed helps control worm population?
Let me see. I'll try a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to Jake and see if he has some input there. But the idea being that since this crop is in the same plant family, the flowers that it has may be particularly attractive to some of the specific beneficials to that particular cabbage worm. So by allowing them to flower, you're increasing the attractiveness of that field to the beneficial insects. Jake, do you want to give that a try?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it pretty well, hit the nail on the head. It's partially attraction, and it's also just maintaining and retaining the predators that you already have on the site. A lot of these natural enemies, I mean, they have insects in general have fairly short lifespans, and they tend to once they find a prey or a host that they like, they tend to stick with it throughout the course of their life. And so, if you have a abundant food source like oftentimes these pests are, you'll have a also fairly abundant assortment of natural enemies that'll be feeding on them. But these may feed on the pests as part of their diet, but also feed on some of the flowers and that are found near and among where they're foraging for the pests. And so if you go through and just completely wipe out that particular crop, maybe some of the insects which were feeding on crops next to it had natural enemies which needed those flowers or those other crops to supplement their diet. And just, I guess, trying to maintain as much stability as possible is very important in order to maintaining those community interactions. You don't want to go and just keep disturbing the site over and over. I know that can't be can't be avoided within the system because it is, a cropping system. It's not a natural area, but trying to reduce that disturbance will help to maintain stability.
Okay, yeah, we were getting quite a few questions about beneficial insects and insectary. Will the flowering of cilantro and other carrot family crops also attract harmful insects?
Go ahead, Jake.
I think that unfortunately that is often the case. There is mixed information out there because the flowering plants, regardless of what they are, often do attract a variety of insects, and that includes both the beneficials as well as the pest species, and also allows them to persist in the site for longer. I don't know that the jury is completely out on whether or not, or I think the jury is still out rather, on whether or not beneficial insectaries, especially whether they're in a clustered setup where you have a lot of your flowering plants in one small portion of the farm, or whether they're distributed throughout the entirety of your farm is better or leads to more control or more pests. I think what it can often come down to is again trying to maintain a certain level of stability, because if the pests have a tendency to be able to increase their population levels after disturbance much more quickly than your natural enemies can. And so if you're constantly disturbing the site, you're knocking most everything out, but then the pests come back first and then your beneficials come in. So if you can reduce the amount of disturbance, then ideally the natural enemy populations would maintain, and that would provide a better control. At least that's the idea.
Yeah, and then I guess what I would add is that because of this problem of perhaps attracting pests with your insectary crops, we really have, at least at Phil Foster Ranches, we have a pretty limited number of insectary crops that we feel are helpful without being detrimental. And you can kind of count them on one hand. White alyssum, cilantro, both Dania cilantro and regular cilantro, white dill and true dill are really the main ones that we're using. That's a pretty small number of plants, and all the other ones we've tried have some sort of negative that eliminates them from being used.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because that was definitely the subject of some other questions about which insectary plants you used. One person said that they saw phacelia and buckwheat mentioned as a cover crop, but not insectary strips. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think they're used as cover crop. They're allowed to bloom briefly and then turned under. I think there's a little bit of, it's a little hard to imagine how something that's only allowed to bloom for a week and doesn't happen all year, and it really only happens once in a while, is going to be particularly helpful, but it probably does stabilize the system to some extent.
Okay, what thresholds are
And
you
as far as
Oh, sorry.
Facility goes, I know that. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I did travel around quite a bit this summer, going to different farms in the Pacific Northwest, and I know that Facilia was much more common up there and on the Olympic Peninsula. There was a group a group of farmers that really did like to use Facilia and thought very highly of it, thought that it worked very well as an insectary for natural enemies, hopefully not providing too much pest problems, and then also kind of all around Western Washington. It seemed to be fairly common, at least with what I saw.
Okay, what thresholds?
Yeah, and Facilia we don't like at all in California. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say we don't like Facilia at all in California because it harbors lygus bug.
Oh.
And it's also fairly susceptible to some of our more dangerous soil diseases.
Okay, so what thresholds are you using for the insects or for the cabbage worms? Are they personalized to the farm, or are they some standard threshold?
Yeah, I mean, I think thresholds is a very interesting thing. You know, most large vegetable farms in California have pest control advisors who scout the farms, and they're really rather motivated that if they find any cabbage worms at all, they're pretty motivated to call for a spray to control them, because the downside is pretty bad, that if the cabbage worms end up in the wholesale crop, and this can be, you know, many acres, it's a huge loss, whereas the cost of one spray, which is effective, is pretty small. So they have very low thresholds before a decision to spray is called. With organic farmers that are being scouted regularly, your thresholds can really be quite high, because as long as you're not that close to harvest, if things get out of control, you can always rely on the BT spray to take control of it at the end. But what we very frequently see is numbers that are decently high, and then they fall off, and nothing needs to be done. But my threshold usually is if I see two of any of the cabbage worms besides diamondback moth out of 20 crops that or plants that I've looked at closely, that's something that I'll put down, and the farmer and I will discuss it, and we'll come to some kind of determination as to if it's a very intense time of year where we feel that the cabbage worms are particularly bothersome. That might trigger a spray. Very often, though, that will trigger a wait. And if the next time I come up with 4 out of 20, that's probably going to trigger some kind of spray, unless it's perhaps on red cabbage, in which case we might let it go to 5 or even 6 out of 20 before some kind of spray will be called for. And we find a lot of diamondback moths in our fields. We never have a problem with them. We never spray for them. I mention them from time to time because there are so many, but they are never a problem. So it's really the other 2 species that are the problem, and those are the ones that we have thresholds for. But you know, this idea of flexible thresholds can really only happen if you have the same person scouting your field in the same way every week. And so if you're the farmer who's doing it, that makes sense. If you've got the same PCA, that makes sense. But if you've got a number of different people scouting, it might be a little harder to do.
Okay, there's some other strategies people are mentioning and wondering if any of these farmers use them. One is row covers, and the other is trap cropping.
Yeah, well, row covers would probably be effective because as long as they're tight, it's going to be pretty difficult for anything but the very small diamondback moth to get in and lay their eggs. Although it's interesting, I have found armyworm under row covers before, so they must get in through, they must be able to find holes a lot easier than some other insects. But yeah, row covers will keep them out for sure if the row cover is intact. But that's sometimes harder to achieve than you might expect, and it does appear as though even a few rips can actually let some of them inside. And what was the other control?
Yeah, we had a couple of questions about whether anyone's tried trap cropping.
Yeah, trap cropping. We've done it at Phil Foster Ranches, not for imported cabbage worm. I'm not really sure why we would why we would do it, because the crop that's going to be most attractive to the cabbage worm is probably the crop that we're growing. And with trap crops, you really want something that's even more attractive. And I don't know, Jake, if you know of any crops that would be more attractive than than broccoli, say, to these cabbage worms.
One
The other
person
thing is,
suggested collards. I just want to mention.
yeah, I would expect, say you were a red cabbage grower, you could probably plant collards, cauliflower, broccoli, almost anything as a trap crop, and the cabbage worms would preferentially go there. And then you would need to control them on that particular crop. But I'm not sure it's particularly applicable in this situation, because even when you'd have your trap crop, I think you would still get those cabbage worms spreading out into the field somewhat. I don't think they would go there in such great numbers as to leave the crop alone, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, just like what you said, I haven't seen a whole lot of success with trap cropping in brassicas. Many of them, as people are often aware, is the same species of plant or very closely related at least, and so there's not that much difference. While there's a lot of kind of physiological, or not physiological, while a morphological difference, like you can see a very different look to the plant. They're often similarly attractive to the pests. And as far as trap cropping, I would agree. I don't know that I've seen a whole lot of success in that area.
Okay, let's see. Flea beetles were mentioned in the description of one farm. What about flea beetles and cabbage maggots on other farms? I just wanted to mention before we go to the answer that we did have a recent webinar on flea beetles and using trap crops for flea beetles. So if anyone wants to check that out, you can find that at the link in our archive, which is at the top of the page that's showing. Anyway, back to, have you noticed that on other farms as well, flea beetles and cabbage maggots?
Yeah, I think both those pests are part of all these systems. My experience with cabbage maggot is, if you're in an isolated farm, as long as you keep things clean on the farm so you don't have a lot of decaying organic matter that's not being actively composted, and you take care of all the rotten carrots that are lying in the ditches, cabbage maggots are really not much of a problem. But when you can't control that, they can be absolutely devastating. And a similar situation with flea beetles. There are particular times of the year when flea beetles are particularly bad. So one of the things we have to be careful of is not looking at these particular pests in a vacuum. We have a number of different cabbage family pests on all the farms, and some of them, such as the cabbage worm, are particularly easily controlled with the systems. Others, such as flea beetles, I think are perhaps a little less well controlled. You could see that on Persephone, that wasn't spraying at all for cabbage worms, was doing some spraying for flea beetles. So each farm's unique. The pests that you have are going to be unique, and so you need to design a system that's going to be unique. That doesn't mean you can't borrow the tools and strategies from other farms, but what you eventually decide upon is going to be unique to your particular farm.
Okay, do you monitor natural enemies in addition to the crop press before spraying? And how does that affect, how does the natural enemy level affect your spraying decision?
Yeah, the natural enemy is huge. So if we, very often I will find a fair number of a particular pest, but it's being attacked fairly severely by the natural enemies. And I merely report that to the farmer, and as long as they agree with me, we enjoy the destruction of the pest and the eventual elimination, well, not elimination of it, but reduction down to the point where we're not worried about it. But that happens extremely frequently. It's a huge part of the scouting process, is knowing that things are about to come under control without help.
Okay, and here's somebody who just wants you to repeat the beneficial plants that you use. You said dill, alyssum, and I know you said cilantro, and was there any other?
So there's two kinds of dill. There's true dill, which is the one that you use for making dill pickles, and then there's white dill, which is also called, I think, toothpick ammy. Then there's the regular kind of cilantro, but there's also an oilseed cilantro, which blooms extremely quickly and then sets seed very quickly. That's really helpful for fast-growing crops that are in and out quickly. And then white alyssum was the other one.
Okay, I just put that in the chat box.
Now that's and that's not to say that there aren't a bunch of other ones that people are using. And again, on particular farms, they may be even more valuable than the ones I've mentioned. These are just the ones that in my sort of scouting and my client base that we found most effective.
Okay. Are all of the 4 farms in an area that has winter freezing to reduce the volume of pests? Would this be another component of organic pest control that would not be available to farmers in South Florida, for example?
Oh, yeah. Do you want to talk to that, Jake? Jake, do you want to talk about freezing bugs?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just getting into that, I think I failed to mention that for most of the LEPs that we were dealing with, freezing is a major component. I know that, or at least I've heard that the diamondback moth, and that Doug has mentioned, is not really a big deal for them, can be a major problem in some of the southern states in the United States where that freezing just doesn't happen and the populations are allowed to persist throughout the year. And so that can be a huge deal, and that can change the entire course of how you're going to attack some of these insects, because some of them, which may seem to be a problem one year, the freeze can knock them out, and then you don't have a problem with them next year. I know as I traveled around, a lot of the farmers I spoke with thought that because of the I think the dryness of this last winter over in Western Washington, they were attributing that to the proliferation of flea beetles throughout this last growing season. So, I mean, the climate has a huge makes a huge difference, and I think Doug can talk about a lot of the farms, especially Phil Foster ranches. They don't really see a whole lot of freezing, and that has a very large effect.
Yeah, I think that's true. And remember, we're trying to really get down a knowledge base. So there's a lot of nuance to understanding all these different pests and knowing when they're going to be a problem and what predisposes you to having a problem. And certainly the dryness of the winter, the warmness of the summer, all these things can kind of, with experience, you can start recognizing patterns and be ready for them. These farm system descriptions are going to have a lot of detail about what's going on in that, and they're really based on, not just going out once and saying, oh, this is happening, but years and years and years of observations. And I guess my hope is that people will see those years of observations and think of them as somewhat equivalent to data points that give some more credibility to the information. Not the strict scientific credibility that we're used to, but certainly something persuasive for someone who practically wants to set up a farm system.
Okay.
And kind of on that same point, but a little bit different. I think it's very important for people to be able to recognize the insects that are on their farms, and not only the ones that are common, but maybe some of the ones that aren't quite as common, because with the kind of the advent and I guess the continuation of invasive species moving in and new pests coming into an area where they weren't previously, some of those patterns and some of that experience that a farmer can gain over time might be negated by a new pest moving in that doesn't behave like all the other ones that like they're used to. And so being able to quickly recognize that, oh, wow, that thing that I see on this plant, there's a bunch of those on these plants, where, I need to know what those are, is very important, because you can't continue to think that these farms are in a bit of a bubble, that they're in a vacuum and away from the others, that there's constantly things dispersing in from other areas, and sometimes those can have dramatic effects.
Okay, here's a question about whether there are problems with wireworms or cutworms in the farms that use pasture as part of their rotations, or when planting vegetable crops following pasture, since this sometimes is a problem.
Yeah, that's really huge. I've seen crops, at least, or farms in California that have come out of pasture, and the wireworms and cutworms have been a real big problem. I can't I don't know Persephone wintergreen well enough to tell you if those are a big problem, but I think having read some of their um, farm system descriptions, I'm not sure I came across those as problems. So it's possible that the way they're doing their pasture is somehow handling both of those pests. But I agree that those are a couple that you need to be very careful coming out of pasture. You also need to be careful of wireworms coming out of tree fruit and going to vegetables. If you have sandy soil and an orchard of apples or something like that, and you turn it into vegetable land, wireworms can be huge for many, many years. We've just managed to overcome about 5 or 10 years of wireworms at one of the blocks at Phil Foster Ranches.
Okay, can you explain what a beetle bank is in terms of plant species and some of the best ways to create one?
You want to take that one, Jake?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. I must admit I don't know a ton about the composition, and it changes from location to location. But the most common beetle banks that I've seen are either high mowed grassy areas or low shrubbery. As far as Doug, I don't know if you have used beetle banks on your guys' farm or on the farms that you deal with that. You know some of the ones specifically that they use, some of the plants.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid that this is something I don't know much about. We messed with it a little bit, but it seems like a lot of California vegetable operations aren't really well suited for beetle banks. The gophers and the slugs and the snails and all kinds of things seem to be limiting that as a possibility for at least the farms I'm familiar with in California. And so I don't have much experience with it, but I think if you web search beetle banks, you'll find plenty of stuff. And I'm sure that we'll have additional eOrganic webinars that will talk about them because they, as I say, they are important at Wintergreen and Persephone.
My advisor, Bill Snyder, just sent me an email to point out that, getting back to trap crops, that Joyce Parker, who just did a presentation for eOrganic, I think a couple weeks ago, talked about trap cropping in brassicas and how they were successful. So I think you can dig into the archives and find that, though
Yeah, definitely. That was the one about flea beetles, and that one is definitely recorded. So yeah, that was a great webinar. So if you're interested in trap cropping, that's definitely a good one to listen to.
Yeah, and then I guess I just want to say, because we're coming to the end here, that really really points out sort of the conflict in this kind of a presentation where, on the one hand, everyone wants to know, is there this one thing or two things that I can do to control my pest? And neither Jake nor I can resist talking about the things that we think are important. And yet we always have to come back to the idea that this is a system that we actually don't feel entirely comfortable picking apart. So there is a lot of tension here between describing a system and saying this works here. There are some tools and strategies that you should consider, but I think I'm quite reluctant to pick a couple of tools and strategies out and say, hey, do these. That's not really what this study was about.
Okay, I also wanted to mention in our archive is a webinar by Helen Athow, who described her system of living mulch at Biodesign Farm. And I know we're getting a couple of questions about that. So if you're interested in finding more about her system, I definitely recommend taking a look in that archive link. And it's a webinar about reduced tillage by Helen Athow, and you'll be able to find it if you just go to the link on that screen and scroll down. Yeah, I'll paste the link to the archive in the chat box because you can't go to it directly. But yeah, we have time for one or two more questions. So yeah, I mean, I guess just about Biodesign Farm. Do you know, Doug, what the living mulch used by Biodesign was?
I used to. I've forgotten. I think it's some kind of a clover, and Helen's going to be upset at me for not remembering what it is. And I suspect that she may have a mixture in there because very often, we're trying for as much diversity as we can get. So I suspect that's probably true. But no, I don't know.
Okay, well, I definitely recommend that webinar, and I put a link in the chat box to the archive, and you'll be able to find it. It's by Helen Athau, so I'll type her name in as well. She'll be giving another webinar this year, so we're excited about that. Let's see, one more question here about BT. It says, clearly BT is king. Can you compare or rank some alternative pesticides? And I guess I'm going to tack on the question about whether you're worried that BT might adversely affect beneficial insects as well.
I guess I can go after that one unless you want it, Jake.
No, I think you probably have a little more experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea with any pesticide, partly philosophically, because we don't want to be perhaps affecting, BT is going to affect the larvae of many different butterfly and moth species, some of which we want to encourage, some of which we don't. So obviously reducing sprays as much as possible so we don't get that non-target pest and is going to be valuable. Also, we don't want to spend money if we don't need to. So we're trying to spray as little as we can, and the less we spray, the less chance we have for resistance to arise. And the less chance we have to hit non-target species. So BT is king, and it's partly because it's more specific than a lot of the other things, but it still is going to sometimes get non-target species. And then I do want to mention that there's a material called Entrust, which is quite effective on cabbage worms, but it has such a bad effect on some of the beneficials that you need to be very careful with that particular material, and try to make sure you're not going to make problems worse with another pest by using it. So most of the other options, things like Pyganic and Trust, have a wider range of things they're going to hit. So they really fit less into a systems approach, perhaps, than the BT does.
Are you concerned about BT resistance as well?
I think the small amount of BT spraying that's going on these farms is probably a lot less likely to be important compared to perhaps the genetic engineering of BT into crops, where they're in the crop all the time for many insects to experience. So they're seeing a lot more than they would on a farm where it's only sprayed sporadically.
I did want to put in that just because a pesticide doesn't have any direct effects against a natural enemy doesn't mean that there won't be any effects at all. When you're removing the food, kind of the food source of a population, the population's going to respond, and regardless of the selectivity, if you put a spray on there that kills all of the cabbage worm or all of the leps, it's going to take time for the natural animal population that may have been reduced because their food supply was gone to both recover to those populations that can provide a measure of control, and also for the natural enemies that are there, for them to start utilizing those caterpillars as a food source again, as they likely had to switch over to something else in order to survive the loss of that food source.
Okay, well, we are out of time, so I'd like to thank everyone for submitting your questions, and say once again that you can find this and our many other upcoming and archived webinars on organic farming and research topics at the link on your screen. Next week, we have a webinar, if you're interested in reduced tillage, on rotational. Well, let's see. It's on no-till, and it's by Jan-Hendrik Krupp, who is a German farmer who spent 3 weeks traveling across the United States. And I really wanted to thank you, Jake and Doug, for presenting this webinar, and thanks to everyone for joining us.